The unexpected challenger. The courtroom hummed with an air of palpable tension, the kind that settles in the room like a heavy fog before a storm. Lawyers and paralegals shuffled papers with practiced precision, their leather-bound briefcases lined up neatly beside them. The soft clicking of polished shoes on the marble floors seemed to mark the passage of time, each step echoing the weight of countless legal battles fought before this very judge. At the center of it all sat Judge Harris, his towering figure casting a shadow over the room as he surveyed the proceedings with a practiced, unwavering gaze. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor and quick wit, Judge Harris rarely tolerated disruptions or distractions. His stern, commanding presence was the very embodiment of authority. It was on this tense stage, where the fate of families and fortunes were decided, that a most unusual figure appeared. The heavy doors to the courtroom creaked open, and all eyes turned instinctively to the figure that stepped through the entrance. At first glance, the teenager who had entered the room seemed out of place. Ethan Daniels, a mere 17 years old, stepped into the lion's den, clutching a battered briefcase so worn that it looked as if it had been through 1,000 battles. His suit jacket hung loosely on his frame, the sleeves far too long, and the collar slightly askew. The mismatch between his youth and the seasoned professionals around him was glaring, and it wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Ethan's eyes scanned the room nervously, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his grip on the briefcase. His face, usually full of youthful energy and curiosity, was now marked with determination. A quiet, resolute determination. The whispers began immediately, passing like wildfire from one lawyer to the next. The room buzzed with disbelief. Who was this kid? What was he doing here? Judge Harris, ever the skeptic, arched an eyebrow and leaned forward in his chair, his voice laced with condescension. "And who might you be?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the teenager. "Lost on your way to the school debate club?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom, the mocking tone of the judge's question serving only to fuel the skepticism swirling in the air. Ethan stood still, refusing to shrink under the weight of the ridicule. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let it show. His voice, when it came, was steady and firm, with a quiet authority that silenced the room. "I'm representing my mother, Your Honor," he said, his eyes meeting Judge Harris with an unwavering resolve. A collective gasp ran through the room. A teenager, barely out of high school, representing someone in a legal matter. The idea seemed absurd to many, and a wave of disbelief swept over the courtroom like a tidal wave. This was a serious case, involving the powerful, wealthy landlord who had evicted Ethan's family from their home. But despite the pressure and the weight of the situation, Ethan held his ground. He was not just another kid in the crowd. He had something to prove, something far greater than himself on the line. Judge Harris, clearly taken aback by Ethan's audacity, leaned back in his chair and adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the young man with a mixture of incredulity and amusement. "Mr. Daniels," he began, his voice dripping with skepticism, "you're telling me that you, with no legal education, no formal training, and not a single day in law school, believe you can handle a case of this complexity?" His words were sharp, cutting through the air like a dagger. "Are you really prepared to stand in front of this court and argue this case as if you were an experienced attorney?" A wave of laughter broke out once more in the room, but Ethan did not flinch. He stood tall, his chin slightly lifted, as if he were already a step ahead of everyone else. His mind raced, but his voice remained steady, unwavering. "Your Honor, the law allows anyone to represent themselves in court. I've spent months preparing for this day. I've read countless books, studied legal precedents, and spent sleepless nights learning everything I could about this case. I'm ready to proceed," he said. For a moment, there was silence. The courtroom was suspended in a kind of disbelief, as if they couldn't quite fathom what they had just heard. A teenager, claiming to have studied law on his own, and now about to argue a case against seasoned professionals. Judge Harris blinked, momentarily taken off guard. It was rare that anyone, let alone a teenager, would challenge him so confidently. He looked at the young man with a mixture of curiosity and doubt, his sharp gaze softening just a fraction. "Very well," he said, adjusting his posture. "Let's see what you've got, Mr. Daniels. Proceed." Ethan took a deep breath and walked to the front of the courtroom, the eyes of every person in the room fixed on him. The weight of their judgment and disbelief was palpable, but he pushed it all aside. He had one mission, and that mission was simple: to fight for his family. He set his battered briefcase on the table in front of him, opening it slowly. The contents were organized meticulously, despite the evidence of wear and tear from the countless nights he had spent poring over documents, law books, and case studies. Ethan pulled out his first piece of evidence, his hands now steady, and began his argument. He laid out the timeline of events leading to his family's eviction, recounting the circumstances with clarity and precision. He spoke about the legal disputes with the landlord, outlining the flawed process and the inconsistencies in the landlord's claims. His words were measured, his arguments well-structured, and as he spoke, something began to change in the room. The smirks and sneers that had once filled the courtroom slowly faded into expressions of disbelief and growing respect. Even the opposing counsel, a silver-haired attorney who had entered the courtroom with an air of confidence, seemed to be shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He, too, had underestimated the teenager who now stood before them. He had assumed that Ethan would be easily dismissed, but with every point Ethan made, it became increasingly clear that this young man was no ordinary teenager. His arguments were sharp, his logic unassailable. He wasn't just reading from a script. He was thinking critically, analyzing, and presenting his case with a sophistication that belied his years. As Ethan moved through the case, detailing how the landlord had manipulated the system, the murmurs in the room grew louder. Judge Harris leaned forward, adjusting his glasses once again, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of his desk. Ethan had their attention, and he knew it. With every word, every fact, he was proving that the doubters had misjudged him. This was not a child playing lawyer. This was a young man with a purpose, driven by an unrelenting passion for justice. But Ethan had one final devastating blow to deliver, a revelation that would turn the tide of the entire case. He paused for a moment, allowing the suspense to build before he pulled out the document that would change everything. The room fell silent as Ethan held up the eviction notice, its edges frayed from the countless times he had examined it. The opposing attorney, who had been so confident just moments earlier, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face paling as he realized that something was about to happen that he could not explain away. Ethan's voice rang out clear and unwavering. "Your Honor," he began, "this is the eviction notice that the landlord used to remove my family from our home. But if you examine it closely, you'll find something troubling." The courtroom leaned in, the room tense with anticipation. Ethan pointed to a signature at the bottom of the page, his finger steady despite the weight of the moment. "This signature," he continued, "belongs to a notary who retired 2 years before this document was dated." The gasps were immediate. The weight of his words settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. The opposing counsel fumbled through his notes, his hands shaking as he tried to find a way to counter Ethan's airtight argument. But there was no rebuttal. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no escaping it. The room fell into stunned silence, the impact of Ethan's revelation sinking in with the force of a tidal wave. Judge Harris, once skeptical and amused, now regarded Ethan with something entirely different: respect. The courtroom, once filled with derision, now buzzed with admiration. Ethan had not only proven himself, he had taken on a powerful force and emerged victorious, all while facing the full weight of the legal world's judgment. In that moment, he showed everyone, including himself, that no one, no matter their age, background, or circumstances, was too small to make a difference. Ethan Daniels had become more than just a teenager in a too-big suit. He had become a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the unbreakable bond between a child and their family. The battle was far from over. But for the first time, Ethan could see the path ahead clearly. And with each step, he would remind the world that even the most unexpected challengers could change the course of history. The fight for justice. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, but it was a silence that held something new. Respect. Ethan Daniels, the teenager who had walked into the courtroom with nothing but a tattered briefcase and an unshakable determination, had just done what no one had expected. He had exposed the truth, revealing the landlord's fraudulent actions in a way that left even the most seasoned attorneys speechless. The room was still, but the weight of his victory was beginning to settle in. The battle, however, was far from over. Judge Harris sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled together in thought. For the first time since Ethan had stepped into the room, his stern face softened, ever so slightly, but it was enough for Ethan to notice. He had done more than argue his case. He had proven something to everyone in that room, including himself. He wasn't just a teenager playing pretend. He was a force to be reckoned with. "Mr. Daniels," Judge Harris said, his voice surprisingly calm, "I must admit, I did not expect to hear such compelling arguments from you. It appears you are not just a teenager after all." Ethan's heart raced, but he stood his ground. He had made his case, and now, all that was left was for the judge to hear it through to the end. But he knew this moment wouldn't be the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. The landlord's attorney, who had been shaken to his core by the revelations Ethan had presented, still refused to concede. He wasn't one to admit defeat easily, especially not to someone he viewed as a mere child. "I'll have you know, Your Honor," the opposing attorney began, his voice trembling slightly, "that while Mr. Daniels may have uncovered a discrepancy, that does not automatically mean his family should be reinstated in the property. The facts are far more complex than this young man understands." The silver-haired attorney's arrogance had returned, but there was an undertone of unease that hadn't been there before. Ethan didn't flinch. He had expected this. The landlord's attorney had spent years defending wealthy clients, people who had the resources to manipulate the system, and he wasn't about to let a teenager, no matter how clever, destroy his carefully constructed narrative. He turned to Judge Harris, trying to regain control of the room. "Your Honor, if I may," he continued, his tone now defensive, "there is a procedure for challenging an eviction, and this young man has only presented part of the picture. There is still much more to consider before we can make any determinations about reinstating his family." Judge Harris raised a hand, signaling for the attorney to stop. "Mr. Hargrove, I believe Mr. Daniels has made his case clear. I suggest we focus on the evidence rather than continuing with baseless arguments." His voice was firm, and the commanding tone he used left no room for further debate. The courtroom was silent once more, but the air had shifted. For the first time, it felt as if the balance of power had tilted. The room that had once been filled with smug certainty now buzzed with the hum of uncertainty. Ethan had turned the tide with his intelligence, his meticulous preparation, and his unwavering belief in justice. Ethan knew he had to keep pressing forward. The landlord's attorney might still try to find a way to win, but Ethan had come too far to back down now. He adjusted his glasses, which had slipped slightly down his nose, and took a deep breath. He turned back to Judge Harris, his voice now steadier than ever before. "Your Honor, I understand the complexity of this case. I know that my family's eviction is not just about one document, one signature, or one mistake. It is about a system that has been manipulated to serve the powerful, while those without resources are left to fend for themselves. I am not here just for my family. I am here for every person who has ever been wronged, for every person who has ever felt like they have no voice in this system." The courtroom was still, each person hanging on his every word. Ethan's voice had gained a new level of strength, no longer the uncertain stammer of a teenager, but the commanding presence of someone who had already fought and won against odds that most adults would find insurmountable. "This is not just about us," Ethan continued, his gaze unwavering. "This is about standing up to a system that has failed so many people. This is about ensuring that those who seek justice can have it, regardless of how old they are or how much money they have. I will not let my family or anyone else be victimized just because we don't have the resources to fight back. The words were simple, but they resonated with everyone in the room. Ethan wasn't just defending his family anymore. He was defending a principle, a belief that everyone deserved the right to fight for what was theirs. And in that moment, he had become more than a teenager in a courtroom. He had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Judge Harris looked at Ethan, his expression unreadable. The old man's mind worked quickly, processing the arguments, the facts, the evidence. Ethan had brought more than just a well-prepared case. He had brought a truth that was undeniable. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers still tapping lightly against the wooden desk. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, as if considering the larger impact of his decision. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Harris finally spoke, his voice calm but full of authority. "I have seen many cases in my time, Mr. Daniels, but rarely have I seen a young man present such a case with the level of competence and passion that you have shown today. While this court must follow the law, I also believe that the law is meant to serve justice, and justice is not always a matter of following procedure without question." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. The entire courtroom was still, watching as the judge considered his next move. "I believe there is more to this case than meets the eye. It's clear that there has been some form of wrongdoing here, and the evidence presented by Mr. Daniels cannot be ignored." He turned his gaze toward the opposing counsel. "Mr. Hargrove, I suggest you review your client's actions carefully, as there are many questions that remain unanswered." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come so far, but this moment was still the most uncertain. He had put everything on the line for his family, and now it was in the hands of the judge. Judge Harris turned to Ethan once more. "Mr. Daniels, I will allow you to proceed with your case, but I expect you to present all the facts, not just the ones that favor your position. If you want to fight for justice, you must be willing to look at all sides of the issue." Ethan nodded, his determination unwavering. "I understand, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "I will not stop until the truth comes to light, and I will not let my mother or anyone else be taken advantage of." With that, the courtroom returned to its state of quiet intensity, the gears of the legal system turning slowly but inexorably. Ethan had come to this place, not as a mere observer but as an active participant in the pursuit of justice. He had already proven his worth. And now, with every word he spoke, he would continue to challenge the systems that had wronged his family. And he would do it with the courage of someone who knew that, sometimes, the most powerful force in the world was simply the will to do what was right. As the proceedings continued, it became clear that the world was watching. Ethan had already started to change the story, not just for his family, but for all those who would find themselves in the same fight. The underdog had risen, and the victory, though not yet fully realized, was already his. A battle beyond the courtroom. The courtroom was charged with an electric energy, as if the very air was crackling with anticipation. Ethan's words had taken root in the hearts of everyone present, and though the case was far from over, the outcome seemed inevitable. He had done what no one thought possible. He had shifted the scales of justice with nothing but sheer willpower, intelligence, and a heart driven by love and determination. But Ethan knew that the fight was far from over. The hardest part was yet to come. The opposing counsel, now visibly unsettled, continued to make feeble attempts to discredit Ethan's findings, but the evidence Ethan had presented had already become undeniable. The forged signatures, the missing documents, and the manipulation of legal procedures were all laid bare. Judge Harris, who had once scoffed at the idea of a teenager stepping up to represent his family, was now deep in contemplation. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the desk, each tap a silent acknowledgement of the remarkable turn this case had taken. However, Ethan understood that this courtroom, despite all the power it wielded, was just one small battleground in a much larger war. A war against an entrenched system that often favored the powerful, a system that could not be dismantled by just one courtroom victory. The road ahead was long, and Ethan wasn't foolish enough to think that winning today would be the end of his fight. As the judge called for a brief recess, Ethan sat back at the defendant's table, his mind racing. His thoughts swirled with a mixture of hope and fear. For every victory, there was a consequence. For every powerful enemy he faced, there would be others who would attempt to undermine his efforts. But it wasn't just his family at stake now. It was every person who had ever been forced into a corner by injustice. Ethan knew that if he didn't succeed, if he couldn't see this through to the end, no one else would. But even as the weight of the case pressed down on his shoulders, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far he had come. The boy who had walked into this courtroom that morning had been filled with doubt and fear, unsure of how he would be received. But now he stood as a beacon of hope, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked by the system. During the brief recess, Ethan was approached by his mother, who had been sitting quietly in the audience, watching every moment unfold. Her eyes were filled with emotion, and for a brief second, Ethan saw a flicker of something he had never seen before: pride. It wasn't just the pride of a mother watching her child succeed. No, it was something deeper. It was the pride of a woman who had been through more than most could imagine, yet still managed to raise a son who was fearless in the face of adversity. "You're doing it, Ethan," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're really doing it. I don't know how you've managed to come this far, but I'm so proud of you. You've given me something I never thought I'd have again: hope." Ethan's eyes welled up for a moment, but he quickly blinked the tears away. His mother's words were everything to him. She had been his anchor through their toughest times, and now he was doing the same for her. "I'm not done yet, Mom," he said, his voice firm. "I have to see this through. We've come too far to turn back now." The recess ended all too quickly, and soon the room was once again filled with the soft rustling of papers, the sound of shoes tapping against the floor, and the low murmur of whispers. Ethan stood, his resolve harder than ever, and returned to the front of the courtroom, where Judge Harris was now seated, his stern expression as unreadable as before. "Mr. Daniels," Judge Harris began, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of respect, "you've presented a compelling case. But as I said before, we must look at all sides of the issue. There's a lot more at stake here than just the eviction of your family." Ethan met the judge's gaze, unwavering. "Your Honor, I understand that. But we can't ignore the truth. My family was wronged, and not just by a faulty legal procedure or a forged document. My family, and countless others like us, have been victims of a system that's stacked against us. That's why I'm here. I'm not just fighting for my family. I'm fighting for the many who can't stand up for themselves." Judge Harris nodded slowly, as if considering the weight of Ethan's words. The silver-haired attorney, Mr. Hargrove, shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the case was heading. The evidence Ethan had uncovered was damning, but he wasn't ready to give up. He had fought for too long, and he wasn't about to let a teenager expose the flaws in his client's actions so easily. "I understand your position, Mr. Daniels," Judge Harris said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "But this case goes beyond the facts. It's about precedent, about setting a course for the future. If I rule in your favor, it could set a dangerous precedent. We cannot allow emotions to cloud the law." Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had anticipated this. This wasn't just about a single case. This was about how the court would view the power of one individual standing against the system. Judge Harris wasn't simply deciding whether Ethan's family would be reinstated in their home. He was deciding whether the rules of justice could be bent to accommodate those without power. "Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice clear and unshaken, "I understand the concerns about setting a precedent. But sometimes the law must be bent, not to accommodate wrongdoers, but to protect those who have been wronged. What kind of precedent do we set if we allow powerful individuals to manipulate the system for their own gain? What kind of message do we send if we let the truth be buried under bureaucracy? The room fell into a deep, contemplative silence. Even the judge's stern gaze faltered for a moment, as if the weight of Ethan's words had struck a chord. Judge Harris leaned forward, his expression softening ever so slightly. "You make a compelling argument, Mr. Daniels," he said slowly, "and I cannot ignore the facts you've presented. This case has revealed a level of corruption that cannot be easily dismissed. I will need time to deliberate, but know this: you have given this court much to consider." Ethan nodded, his heart still racing, but his determination unshaken. He had done everything he could. He had fought for justice not just for his family, but for every person who had ever been pushed to the margins by a system that was supposed to protect them. Now it was in the judge's hands. The decision would come soon, but for now, Ethan could only hope that the truth, and the courage to speak it, would prevail. As the court session adjourned for the day, Ethan stood in the quiet stillness of the room, his mind still processing the weight of what had just transpired. He had never imagined this journey would be easy, but he had never imagined that he would be standing here, changing the course of his family's future, and perhaps even the future of many others. He turned to his mother, who had been watching him every step of the way, her eyes filled with pride and admiration. "We're not finished yet, Mom," he said with a quiet smile, "but we're closer than we've ever been." And in that moment, Ethan Daniels knew that no matter the outcome, he had already won. He had proven that even in a world full of obstacles, the strength of one person's resolve could be enough to start a wave of change. Part 4. The Final Judgment and the Lesson of the Journey. The following days felt like an eternity. The courtroom was quiet, with whispers of speculation filling the air, but the case was now in the hands of Judge Harris. Ethan spent those days, not with his head buried in case notes, but with his family, his mother, who had been through the worst of it, and his younger sister, who looked at him with a mix of awe and wonder, as if he had somehow become their protector, their hero. Ethan understood now that the battle he had fought was far more than just a legal contest. It was a fight for the future, a fight to redefine what it meant to stand for justice, no matter your age or background. When the day of the final ruling arrived, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread of the teenager who had taken on the system and fought back with unwavering conviction. News outlets had covered the story, and people far beyond the courthouse were following the case. It was clear that this wasn't just about one family. It was about something bigger, a moment that could change the way people viewed power, justice, and the very structure of the law. Judge Harris entered the courtroom with the same air of authority as ever. His black robe swept the floor as he made his way to the bench, the gavel in his hand ready to deliver his decision. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his mother beside him, both of them anxiously awaiting the outcome. It was a moment that felt surreal, a moment that would either mark the beginning of a new chapter or bring them back to the harsh reality they had known before. Judge Harris didn't waste any time. He adjusted his glasses, looked over at Ethan and his mother, and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "After careful consideration of all the facts and evidence presented, I have come to my decision." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared himself for the worst. He had come so far, fought so hard. He had exposed the truth, but was it enough? Would the system, entrenched as it was, allow for a victory in the name of fairness? Judge Harris continued, his voice steady. "This court has been presented with undeniable proof of corruption in the legal proceedings that led to the eviction of Mr. Daniels' family. The landlord, Mr. Hargrove's client, engaged in illegal practices that violated the very foundation of fairness and justice. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the Daniels family." A wave of relief washed over Ethan like a tidal wave, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. His mother squeezed his hand, tears of joy and disbelief streaming down her face. Ethan blinked, struggling to keep his composure as the reality of the victory began to sink in. His family would get their home back, but more than that, they had shown the world something invaluable: the power of one individual's fight for justice. Judge Harris paused for a moment, looking directly at Ethan. "Mr. Daniels, I commend you for your courage and intelligence. You have shown this court and this community what it means to fight for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. The system may not always be kind, but it is the truth and the courage to speak it that can make a difference. Let this case stand as a reminder that justice is not only for the wealthy or the powerful, it is for everyone." Ethan, still reeling from the judgment, stood to his feet, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Your Honor." But the gratitude in his words was not just for the judge. It was for every person who had ever been silenced by fear, for every family that had been torn apart by unjust systems. It was for the belief that, no matter how small or powerless you might feel, you could always stand up and fight. As the courtroom slowly began to empty, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. The battle had been long and difficult, but it had taught him something far greater than any legal precedent or technicality. The real victory was in the journey itself. The lesson was clear. Justice, no matter how elusive it may seem, begins with one voice, one person willing to stand up, to speak the truth, and to push against the forces that try to silence them. Ethan had started this fight for his mother, for his family. But in the end, it was about something bigger. It was about the belief that anyone, regardless of their age, background, or resources, could make a difference. It was about the courage to challenge a system that seemed untouchable, and the understanding that true power lies not in money, influence, or experience, but in the unwavering belief that what's right will always find a way to prevail. Ethan's story didn't end with the courtroom's decision. His journey had only just begun. As he walked out of that courthouse, his head held high and his heart full, he knew that the fight for justice didn't stop with his family's eviction. There would always be more battles to fight, more voices to lift, and more injustices to right. But he also knew that he was no longer just the teenager who had taken on the system. He was a young man who had proven, beyond a doubt, that no one is too small to make a difference. The world, for all its flaws, still held room for people like him, people who refused to back down, who were willing to speak truth to power, and who understood that justice could be a force for change in even the most unlikely of places. Ethan Daniels had not just won a case. He had won the right to believe that in this world, one person could change everything. And that belief would be the foundation on which he would build his future, a future where justice would never be an afterthought, but the very essence of everything he did. The courtroom may have closed, but the ripple effects of Ethan's actions would be felt for years to come. His courage would inspire others to take up the mantle, to speak out, and to fight for what was right, no matter the odds. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. The lesson was simple. The pursuit of justice begins with one step, one person, and the belief that the truth, no matter how small, can change the world.